All right, welcome. Thank you for being here. My name's Aaron. I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team at the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before I get started, I want to draw your attention to the note in the chat box. Microphones are disabled for all participants, but if you have questions or comments throughout today's session, please enter them in the chat. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Reed, who is our technical support person today. And also, please note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate toward others per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. I'll kick off our webinar today with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to the Northeast Chapter authors. Next slide. The U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. This program convenes 15 agencies to advance climate and global change science and to provide useful and usable information to decision makers. Next slide, please. The same law that established the program also mandates a periodic scientific assessment known as the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. NCA is a quadrennial report that analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors: the natural environment, agriculture, energy, land and water resources, transportation, human health, social systems, and biodiversity. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. The NCA is used by organizations and individuals for a variety of purposes, including national policymaking, risk management in the private sector, local mitigation and adaptation planning, as well as by practitioners, utility managers, and educators, just to name a few. Next slide, please. The NCA authors review a large body of scientific research from diverse information sources. They synthesize that information, examine the confidence in our scientific understanding, and evaluate uncertainties. NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 260 technical contributors from every state in the nation, as well as Puerto Rico, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, and Palau. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant. Authors distill their findings into accessible language framed around risks to people and important resources. That said, the report is strictly not policy prescriptive, and it doesn't advocate for particular viewpoints or policy measures. The NCA uses a wide range of future projections to help decision makers understand the full extent of possible risks that can be avoided or reduced under different scenarios, and then leaves it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. The assessment is compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies, including the Global Change Research Act, as well as other laws that govern things like information quality, accessibility, and transparency. Finally, the report process employs extensive review, including several opportunities for public engagement, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, and several government science reviews. Now let's check out the NCA5 table of contents. Next slide, please. Like previous NCAs, NCA5 covers national level topics, regions, and response actions. The report opens with an overview, which is followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. There are the national topic chapters, 10 regional chapters, and 2 response chapters, although response actions are discussed throughout the report. The NCA table of contents has evolved over time, informed by user input. NCA5 added 2 new chapters, one on economics and one on social systems and justice. We also have 5 new focus features on compound extreme events, Western wildfires, COVID-19, supply chains, and blue carbon. We have several appendices, including a new one dedicated to indicators. Now that we've gone through some introductory background, it's my pleasure to introduce Jess, the chapter lead of the Northeast chapter, who will lead us through the remainder of the webinar today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and thank you everyone for attending. I'm Jess Whitehead. I was the chapter lead for the Northeast chapter of the 5th U.S. National Climate Assessment. I am also the executive director for the Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience at Old Dominion University, based in Norfolk, Virginia. Today, I have joining with me from my co-authors, Aaron Lane, Melissa Finucane, and Mark Bove. And we also have Ella McCrae, who was our federal coordinating lead author, who will be with us and available for question and answer. I'd like to start off by acknowledging all of our co-authors on this chapter. The Northeast is a very large region, 12 states plus Washington, D.C., and it meant that we needed to have a very large author team. We very deliberately, as we reached into folks who had volunteered and recruited a few people who we needed to talk into doing the chapter with us, in addition to those who'd volunteered, to try to make sure that we had authors from geographically throughout the region, as well as a diversity of authors coming from both academic and practice, including nonprofits, local governments, or had past local government experience, and the private sector. We really also tried to strive for diversity in career stage. So we have some relatively early career authors who were able to join us on the team. I felt tremendously honored to be able to lead this group of folks. They were really just an outstanding group of people to work with, and are the people who really, really deserve the credit for the chapter. They brought all of their expertise, all of their teamwork, all of their problem-solving skills to squeezing as many things as we possibly could into our word limit for this chapter. So thank you to all of the co-authors. Our key takeaways for NCA5 are structured to try to tell a story with a mix of researchers and practitioners on our team. We really wanted to make sure that the approach we were bringing to the chapter leaned into the charge from USGCRP to be policy relevant without policy prescription. And so that meant telling the story of what's happened since the last NCA in 2018. So if you actually step back and you read just our key takeaways as our shortened versions of our key messages, that in and of itself should tell the story of our chapter. We really saw that the impacts of the chronic impacts of extreme weather and the ways that those impacts are shaping adaptation and mitigation throughout the Northeast as really the foundation for our chapter, not just on the terrestrial and human side, but also on the ocean and coastal side. We very, very clearly began to see emerging in the literature the challenge that these impacts are not equal on everyone throughout the Northeast. The disproportionate impact of these events continues to highlight the need for making equitable policy choices. And so there is a lot of attention in the chapter to what's being done and the status of what is being done to address that. We saw climate action happening throughout the region, both adaptation and mitigation, and happening in each state as well as Washington, D.C. And also tried to give several examples of tribal adaptation plans as well to document that work that's being done by tribal nations and tribal governments and tribal peoples throughout the Northeast. And finally, and Mark Bove will talk about this at the end of our presentation today, we really saw that people who are getting things done are doing it because they have money to do it, frankly. So we took a look in one of our key messages at that level on what we do and don't know about how implementation of climate action is happening because of the presence of funding. So with that, I want to hand it over to Erin Lane with USDA.
Thanks, Jess. So in our region, with climate change, we notice that we're continuing to experience this increasing trend of extreme weather. And for us, that means heavy rain and heat waves. And as these experiences intensify, we see our region is actually responding. So the weather events becoming chronic is actually shaping how we adapt and the effort that we are putting toward mitigation. So in this 4-panel graph, we see days with 2 inches of rain increased 50% since 1958, and that's as compared to the average over that period. But the days with 5 inches of rain in the lower right increased 100% over the long-term average. So these are bigger storms. They're larger amounts of rain that's happening in shorter periods of time. And through all this, we're seeing that we need to be collecting precipitation data at the sub-daily or even sub-hourly timescale to further see how precipitation dynamics are changing. And these intense rain events are combined with sea level rise and storm surges, which are especially problematic for flooding in our coastal areas. We also have the heat waves that are lasting longer, becoming more severe, and we may be seeing not more drought, but it's not decreasing as much as we might expect. So the next slide. All this is spurring action in the form of new mapping efforts, planning at the state, local, regional, tribal level, and climate change is being incorporated into hazard mitigation plans and adaptation plans. And these plans that were written 5 years ago are now being implemented in all these ways that you see on this map. So we're seeing this inclusion of not just adaptation, but also climate mitigation, which is reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and increased carbon sequestration strategies. And many of these efforts are including natural climate solutions or nature-based features. Next slide. So one of the ways that we investigated this is seeing this increase in efforts by tracking trends of newspaper articles mentioning heavy and extreme rain and heat with nature-based solutions. And there's this coupled increase since 2000. So as the extreme events become chronic, efforts to adapt and mitigate climate change have also increased, and using the nature-based solutions is becoming central to these efforts.
Thank you so much, Erin. I am going to try to do justice to our key message 2 on ocean and coastal impacts. I'm much more of a coastal person than an ocean person, but we had an incredible team on this. So hopefully if anyone was able to make it today, I don't misspeak. Similar to the ways that we were seeing these impacts on the land areas of the Northeast, we also see a similar trend in these ocean and coastal impacts that are also driving adaptation to climate change in ocean areas and coastal areas. In particular, oceans are growing much warmer and marine heat waves are much more frequent, and that's beginning to impact the marine ecosystems within the Northeast. These changes are unprecedented in recorded history and include ocean warming, marine heat waves, sea level rise, and ocean acidification. The changing conditions in particular are causing significant shifts in ecosystems, particularly with distribution of species, how productive the productivity of those species, and the timing of those species' life cycle events. When they spawn, when they migrate, those kind of key elements. And these impacts are spurring adaptation efforts, whether it's the direct adaptation efforts and result to needed changes in fishing effort, or indirect efforts because of species that are further down in the food chain. We're really beginning to see those changes throughout the Northeast. In particular, with sea surface temperature anomalies for the Gulf of Maine, as an example, what we see in this particular figure is the differences in the long-term average are estimated compared from 1982 to 2011. And the days meeting these marine heat wave criteria are marked here. So what you can see, especially since the early 2010s, is this real increase in marine heat waves in the Gulf of Maine as an example for the region. Coming back to the idea of some of these shifts in species, these changes are really affecting things that we care about in the Northeast. in a large part because they're species where a lot of people like to eat them, or people make their living because people like to eat them. I'm sure that those of you who are biologists are horrified at me putting it that way, but that's kind of where we see a lot of which of these species are affected. There's also species that are affected that we care about because they are threatened. Right whales, for example. And these key species are responding to changes that are impacting productivity at the base of the ocean ecosystem. They're responding to heat waves. They're having to move. So lobster in the Gulf of Maine. And fishermen are having to adapt where they go then to catch those species. The species are specifically shifting those lifetime history events in particular. And again, an example from the Gulf of Maine here are looking forward from, in the past compared to 1985, going forward to 2050, seeing species in particular that are either increasing or decreasing in abundance. With better management, for example, Atlantic cod abundance will tend to increase, but it is going to be counteracted by decreasing productivity due to warming. Right whales in particular, assuming that we have better management for the species to recover, will need to move out of the Gulf of Maine. So that's the horizontal arrows, because of those impacts on warming in terms of the distribution and the abundance of their prey. So beginning to see these actual have impacts for species that we can track. As I am a coastal person, I would be remiss if out of everything that's packed in there, I didn't call out also habitat change on the coastal side. As sea levels rising, the water table is also rising and becoming closer to the surface. We also see tidal flooding and storm surges reaching further inland. And what we're seeing throughout the Northeast, including the Chesapeake Bay, increasing forest dieback and conversion of forested wetland to now standing water wetland. So beginning to see that loss, and we expect it to continue and accelerate through 2100. So coming to key message 3, I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa.
Thanks so much, Jess. So key message 3 turns us to human impacts and notes that the climate change impacts in the Northeast are not equally distributed across different groups in our communities. And it also highlights the importance of equitable planning and policy choices. The literature shows that disproportionate impacts from extreme heat or storms or flooding or other climate-related hazards are notable among racial and ethnic minorities, people of lower socioeconomic status, and older adults. These climate impacts compound other existing environmental health and socioeconomic burdens already experienced by people in these communities. And these burdens also include historical racially based injustices such as redlining, which was a discriminatory practice introduced in the 1930s, where federal loans and insurance were refused or limited in specific geographic areas. Other historic examples include the land dispossession and forced migration of Indigenous people and chronic disinvestment in communities of color. So the figure on this slide gives an example of neighborhoods in the Bronx in New York. The map on the left shows that relative to non-redline neighborhoods, so those are the areas represented by the A's and the B's, the historically redlined areas, which are the C's and the D's, show consistent patterns of elevated land surface temperatures. And you can also see this pattern in the box plots on the right, which show that average summer temperatures are highest in the historically redlined areas. But more generally, research shows us that people of color tend to live in census tracts with higher urban heat temperatures than non-Hispanic whites. And this difference is particularly pronounced in the Northeast. Another example is that compared with the historic territories of Indigenous people, present-day tribal lands experience nearly 2 additional extreme heat days per year and a decrease of nearly 23% in annual average precipitation. And then let me just finish with a few words on how local efforts to improve equity in climate adaptation are improving, even though the outcomes are still uneven throughout the Northeast. So one example relates to managed relocation initiatives in flood-prone areas, such as buyouts, which is where homeowners sell their property to the government and the land is restored to open space. We see that buyouts by local governments tend to be more common in counties with larger populations and income, but the bought out properties tend to be concentrated in areas of greater social vulnerability within the counties. So in other words, the bought out properties tend to be in relatively poorer areas where residents have lower levels of education and English language proficiency and greater racial diversity. The reasons for this pattern are not yet clear, but it does highlight the importance of evaluating buyout implementation and outcomes along multiple dimensions. And then I'll just conclude with one final example of efforts to address equity can be seen in New York City's planning initiatives. Their plans have cited the disproportionate health impacts of extreme temperatures on certain populations and therefore focus their heat mitigation investments on developing green space in underserved neighborhoods. And it has been an absolute pleasure to work with Jess, and I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thank you, Melissa. All right. Key message 21.4 focuses on the degree to which climate action plans are being implemented throughout the Northeast. We have really seen this level of action both in greenhouse gas mitigation and climate adaptation move forward throughout the Northeast at all jurisdictional scales. Almost every state in the region has conducted or updated a climate impact assessment. And even where there is an exception and there has not been action at the state level, we have seen action at the municipal level within the state. So all across the board, local governments, state governments, tribal organizations, and tribal governments are acting on climate change. The innovative approaches to adapting to or to reducing the harmful effects of climate change are beginning to move toward improving the transparency, inclusivity, and equitable processes within those action planning processes. In particular, although ambitious emissions reductions targets have been put forward by many of these states, so far meeting those goals is proving to be challenging for many places. So progress is taking place, but it's very, very deliberately fought progress. One of the more useful things that we hope that people will be able to take away from this chapter is Table 21.1. What Table 21.1 does is it provides live links to all of the state level and a selected number of tribal climate impact assessments, climate action plans, and climate-related laws that we could find that have been enacted since the last national climate assessment. So our hope here is in terms of, again, leaning into being policy relevant without policy prescription. If you are wondering what other states are doing, in particular because you are someone who is interested in being involved in that, what you can do with this table is use it as a resource to be able to go and find all of these documents in one place. So we're very proud of that. I have to say it was a very challenging exercise to get all of these together and figure out how to present it in a table on the website that was live and then also makes sense when it's a PDF. And I hope that we did a good job in this and that people will be able to find this as a usable resource. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark Bove to talk about Key Message 5.
Thanks, Jess. as just mentioned earlier, no climate action plan is going to be implemented if you don't have any funding for it. So we looked at this both from individual risk finance of climate as well as private and public sector. And really the main way most individuals intersect with climate change is with extreme events, whether it's hurricanes, extreme heat, or particularly flooding, which is really moving with our warming climate, particularly in the Northeast. It becomes more and more important that people have coverage, insurance coverage, particularly for flooding. And unfortunately, most people do not buy flood insurance for one reason or another, too expensive, don't feel they have enough coverage. But you can see on the chart here, most of the coastal areas of the Atlantic coast of the Northeast does have a relatively large take up of flood insurance, but most counties inland where we're seeing more extreme flash flooding, really the take up rate by household is only usually 1% or less. So if you do not have flood insurance and you experience a flood, the government is not going to fully bail you out unless you have a flood insurance policy. So it is very critical that we move and try to figure out ways as a society to get more flood insurance coverage into individuals' hands so they can have financial resiliency if the worst case scenario happens to them and where they live. We also looked at private sector investment in climate change, and there is a hefty amount being invested in the US and Canada every year, almost 100 billion, but most of that money is being focused internally, development of green energy, installation of EV electric vehicle infrastructure and developing fleets of electric vehicles. Not much is going out from the private sector into public sector funding and others, but that is starting to develop as well. A lot of private sector companies are now providing climate related services to public sector and other entities, as well as we have climate intermediaries being developed to help try to link people with money that want to invest and get a return on investment on climate risk mitigation and adaptation, and finding partners that need that money. So this is really a critical area that's starting to develop. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, the most funding for resilience is still coming from the private sector, and some of it comes from the federal government, but a lot is actually financed at the state level, particularly through different types of voter-approved bonds and other types of initiatives. And you can see here's a selection of efforts that have been made, and this is a very good step. The Northeast has been a very progressive leader in having public funding for resilience, but still it's really not enough. And one of the major issues here is funding can vary greatly from both federal and public sources. And when you have such large fluctuations in funding towards climate resilience, it's really hard to plan ahead for municipalities or cities or counties to develop plans and that they have a fixed amount of money, but if they don't know if they're getting 5 million or 50 million, that makes a big difference. And we need to hopefully have more consistent sources of funding as things progress over the years. And with that, I will pause and turn it back to Jess. Thank you.
Thank you. Really quickly, just in closing, I want to direct folks to the NCA5 resources page. When you go to the website nca2023.globalchange.gov, there is a downloads tab. You can go there if you are not somebody who finds working with the website to be very accessible. The USGCRP has almost finished completing all of the PDFs for our chapters. I believe the PDF chapter for the Northeast chapter is very close, if not already uploaded. But it should be uploaded very, very soon if working with the PDF is easier for you to access. So I did just want to highlight that. And with that, I would like to open it up for questions, leave you with the citation and how to connect with USGCRP going forward.